right, as people are rejoining us, I just want to share briefly an intro into this next segment of our training, the topic of actually planning your small group. And so with Chris, we sort of cast a vision of why small group ministry is important. It's how people actually build friendship, grow in your faith. I love to, it's sort of what Jesus did, right? He grabbed a small group of people and had this vision for growth. They each went a separate direction to multiply and make disciples of all nations. In the booklet in section 2 on planning your small group, we cover 4 areas. The first is preparing for your small group. Secondly, some tips on how to actually make an invitation, as Chris was referencing earlier. Some questions to answer and reflect upon in terms of how to host your group, thinking about where you might want to meet, what's a good space, depending on whether you're doing a Bible study or an activity type group, like the beer club, which actually sounds delicious at this point. And then some of the follow-up steps, so that when a small group season, maybe those 10 weeks ends, how do we help people be mobilized for discipleship from that point on? And so at this point, it's my pleasure to introduce Lisa Litwin, who's a friend and at the University of Maryland. So Lisa is the coordinator of campus ministry for the Catholic Terps at the University of Maryland. She has 11 years of experience in campus ministry and received her master's degree in theology from St. Joseph's College in Maine, and currently lives in Hyattsville, Maryland with her husband, Matt. So Lisa, thank you so much for joining us and for sort of grappling with this plan of small group ministry, and I'll hand it over to you.
You're so very welcome. I'm really glad to be here with you all today. One thing that's funny about running this section of the talks is I love to plan, but COVID has thrown a wrench in planning like no other. And so just in terms of our ministry at the Catholic Center, we've transitioned from, in May, I have the entire fall semester planned to today, I have next week planned. But the great thing about planning for small groups is it's one of these things that we can do in COVID. Like if we need to go virtual, we can do that. They're small by nature, so if we do it in person, the numbers work out. So I'm really excited to be here today and to just be promoting small groups, because that's our entire ministry this semester is going to be small group based. So it's very relevant. The first thing I wanted to talk about tonight is just a reminder to myself and to you all that in planning, we can't give what we don't have. And so just the importance of our own commitment to our prayer and sacramental life is so key. Living out that lay vocation where we set that time aside. Maybe it's in the morning, maybe it's at night, maybe it's in your car, listening to a podcast. Maybe it's getting to one daily mass per week if that works in your schedule. It can and should look as diverse as each of us are, but that in being a minister in the church and leading a small group, we're giving out of this overflow from our prayer life. I was laughing reviewing my notes because this morning my schedule got totally messed up. Well, actually, I just overslept. So I didn't pray in the morning. That's when I usually pray. And instead, I was looking at the notes at 5 o'clock today and stopped and had my prayer time then because I didn't do it this morning. So just that encouragement that ultimately these small groups we lead are not about us, but they're about Christ. And so to make sure that we're connecting with Christ on a regular basis, and that prayer and that sacramental life is filling us up, and our planning comes out of that. So the next thing I want to talk just briefly about is that we obviously are part of the Catholic Church. And so our vision for small groups is not independent groups that are disconnected from the greater church. Rather, our small groups are connected to a parish, maybe a lay movement, Catholic organizations in the diocese, or the Archdiocese itself. And so within whatever group you're connected to, like the greater group, we also don't want to have what I call like secret small groups. I just believe that if there's a small group happening for young adults that's connected to DC Catholic, or through, Focolare, or through your local parish, people should know about it and be able to join it. And so at the parish level, part of that connection piece is actually, if this is a new thing you're starting, going to your pastor and saying, what needs do you see in the parish? What small group needs are you seeing? Here's what I'm passionate about. Here's what God's putting on my heart, and just have a conversation and to be able to work together. And that way, you know, you're connected to the greater church. And ultimately, I think that brings more people into small group ministry and greater success to the small group. Now, as we get into like the nitty gritty details, this is something that is a quote from Living as Missionary Disciples, which is a small little pamphlet that I highly recommend. It has a lot of information about small groups, actually. But this line really jumped out to my team and I a couple years ago when we read this about permeating the planning process with prayer. And so I'm about to give you a whole list of things to think about as you plan your small group. And it can get a little like, oh gosh, that's a lot. Maybe it's a little overwhelming. But I just want to encourage you to, as you plan, bring the plans to prayer. And I think that's how we can, be open to the inspiration of the Holy Spirit and maybe get like new ideas and new insights as we plan, but also again, bring it back to like, it's not about me and it's not all on me. So pray as you plan. And as you plan and as we get into the weeds, here are some of the things you want to think about. So Chris talked about this, the who. Who has God placed on your heart to serve? Is it just men? Is it just women? Is it young couples? Is it teenagers? Is it young adults? Is it retired people? Is it more general? Like, I want to run something that anyone in the parish can join. Whatever the case may be, you just want to have basically a target audience. And then after you assess and discern that, what is this group going to be about? So you're going to choose your content. I highly recommend not developing your own content. There's so many resources out there that excuse me, are already developed books with small group questions at the end of each chapter. Things from Ascension Press, programs for men and women like Endow or Walking with Purpose or That Man Is You, Focus, Bible studies when you're talking about young adults, Life Team when you're talking about youth ministry. So go out there and see what's out there and choose what the content will be for this group. And then you want to think about, when will you have it? And I couldn't agree with what Chris said more. I think that small groups that meet more regularly, so maybe you give a small group that you're starting a 4 to 6 week run as an initial, invitation, tends to be better, I think, than monthly small groups. But truly, you can decide what's best for you and for your group. But you'll want to decide, okay, when are we going to meet, for how long, what's the frequency, day of the week, day of the month, etc. And then, of course, where. And with COVID, we have to pay attention and listen to what is coming from the county, what is coming from the Archdiocese, if we're talking about in person. There's a lot we can do hybrid, which is wonderful, because that means people who are comfortable being in person within those limits can attend, and people who aren't can call in or Zoom in, and we meet both needs that way. Or of course, doing like we're doing right now, an all virtual small group. One thing I forgot to put on the slide here is thinking about how will people sign up. And I think this is another opportunity or a point of connection with people. You can have a sign up form that you're pointing people to. You can just point people to email you. You could use Flocknote, talk to your pastor and see if he'll let you use what's called a text to join code. And the communications office can help you with that too. And that's a kind of a cool way where people text small group to a certain number and you'll get their contact info, and super easy for them to sign up. Now, as people sign up, a great thing to do is follow up with each one of those people. So don't just collect emails or cell phone numbers and the first thing they hear from you is small group starts tomorrow. something we try to do in our ministry is every student that registers with us, every student that says, I want to be in a small group, every student that says, I want to join RCIA, we email or even call them and just have a little conversation, find out how they found out about what they're wanting to get involved with, and if they have any questions. And that little extra connection can go a long way in helping someone go from I signed up to I show up, whether that's virtually or online. And then the last two things, kind of getting into the details of planning, is thinking about how can your small group be as hospitable as possible. And this is something we've really spent a lot of time focusing on at the Catholic Student Center in every aspect of our ministry. So if you're able to meet in person, thinking about, okay, say you're meeting at the parish and it's a little confusing to find the meeting room because there's a long hallway or it's in some like back corner of the building. Having part of your team that you've recruited, which we'll talk about in a minute, to have someone at the front door, to maybe even have someone at the parking lot. Just thinking through the details like that. Having name tags, maybe for the first 2 events, or even the whole time. Just it takes away that awkwardness of like, I've asked your name 2 times and I cannot ask it again. It's just not going to work out, or it's going to be awkward. You know, again, if it's in person, like what's the environment? Can you have some background music going for the first time people come? Can you have food for the first time people come? Can you have food every time? Can you have wine and beer every time? You know, like you figure out what's going to work best for the group that you're creating. And then if you're doing it online, also, like we don't scratch hospitality. I think it actually becomes even more important because we're missing some of just like the natural cues that we have in person. So thinking about with your team, okay, who's gonna start the call, and can that person just acknowledge each participant as they come, and maybe have a little question prepared to get conversation going. Another thing I've seen work really well when people are using Zoom is to have an initial question that people, something that's simple like, how was your day today? Or how are you feeling? Where people can just type in a 1-word response, and then the small group leader can say, hey, Sally, do you want to elaborate that on that a little more? And it's just a way, again, to kind of help conversation happen virtually. I really liked what Chris said about virtual meetings needing to be shorter than you would have in-person ones. So I think that's a great thing to think about as well. And then this is in your booklet, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but just creating an entire plan for each small group meeting. So look in the booklet that Jonathan talked about for details about that, but creating a sample schedule with your team, again, recruiting with maybe the pastor or your friends, who's going to help you run this group. No one should be running a small group alone. And figure out how can you delegate different pieces of the small group, from who's going to lead the content to, you know, who's going to send out reminders, to who's going to do hospitality and different aspects like that. So I want to touch next about invitations, and similar to what Chris said, I'll just reemphasize. So you can have active invitations, which I think are the mass announcement, the tabling after mass, you know, asking the pastor what other resources might be available. That's kind of like a in front of people option. And then passive invitations, like the bulletin and the email list, and emailing, you know, Family Life or Jonathan and Molly, and getting on the young adult listserv, and making sure that you have excellent advertising in those passive places, like you've made a good flyer, everything's looking good, spelled right, you know, all the details are correct, and maybe there's a compelling picture, or a quote or something that can help bring people in. But the best way to invite is what Chris said, is those intentional invitations. And so part of the planning process is you're sitting down with your team and you're brainstorming who are the 3 people that each of us are going to invite. And I would even take it a step further. This is something we've done with our students at Maryland, to say, we're each going to write down the person or the people that we're going to invite. And next time we meet, we're going to check in and say, did I do it? You know, what was the response? And it's okay if people say no. It's just, I think we have a responsibility and hopefully like a passion to invite the people we do know. And we've been thinking at the Catholic Center a lot about the lost sheep parable. And so who is that person maybe that you know that is currently disconnected or struggling, that you can go after and invite to your small group? And then I already talked about this earlier, just following up with signups, doing that personal affirmation that, hi, thanks for signing up. Do you have any questions? You know, I'm looking forward to meeting you, you know, whenever the group starts, and kind of letting that not just sit there until the day before. Oh, 1 second here. Okay, moving on. Hosting, I just sort of walked us through that, and you're gonna have a whole other time tomorrow on hosting. But just to reiterate the importance of rolling out that hospitality plan as your group happens, making sure that your whole team is invested in different roles so you're not doing everything, and following that plan that you create. Oops, go back one. Okay, the last thing I'm going to talk about is follow up after or even during the group. So something to think about is, how can you connect with your small group members outside of the group meetings? So maybe that's working with your team and everyone kind of saying, I'm going to connect with these 3 people. And maybe it's just a simple text once in a while to check in and see how they're doing. Maybe you've really hit it off with 1 or 2 people and it's grabbing coffee with them. Maybe it's having someone in your small group's family, you know, over for dinner, if that's appropriate with all the COVID things. Phone calls and texts are maybe better in these times. But just thinking about how can you invest in them, and that's part of how we can accompany people, walk with them even in a deeper way than we can in the small group setting. Another way to think about this is, okay, who's in my group and what are the next steps that they might need encouragement in their faith journey? So maybe it's more formation in a particular area, suggesting like, hey, you're asking a lot of questions about this. I really want to recommend you check out this book, and maybe we could get together and talk about it sometime. Maybe it's that encouragement towards more personal prayer, or towards taking that step to come to Sunday Mass more regularly. In this small group, you're going to hear where people are at, and very gently and not judgmentally, there's a way that we can just encourage people to take that next step in their faith. Other things could be getting more involved in the parish. I was talking to a pastor earlier this week, and he's starting a young adult group, and part of their vision is that anyone can be part of these young adult small groups, but they also want them to be involved in the parish in some way. So maybe that's inviting them to teach CCD or show up and be a greeter once a month, but just providing opportunities outside of the small group. And of course, like Chris said, raising up the next generation of leaders. Like ideally from within every small group we start, there just will naturally be 1 or 2 leaders who can maybe start the next group, either as the group grows or just as that vision for multiplying these small groups unfolds in people's hearts and people's minds. I know the small group that I'm a part of at my parish, during COVID, my small group leader emailed me just to reach out and see how I was doing. And that really meant a lot to me. And another woman in my group actually bought my husband and I dinner because we moved in the middle of COVID, so no one could come help us. But she offered that, like, hey, let me Uber Eats dinner to you. And so those extra connections, like outside of the group, really meant a lot to me. And I think when we do that as leaders for others, it can really go a long way in building relationships and building up the community. So I just want to end there with just an encouragement to be not afraid to step into this role if it's new to you, to be not afraid if you're returning back to it after a little hiatus, and to just know that I think this is a beautiful time for us to be investing in small group ministry as a church. It's something we can do in the midst of COVID. And so with that, I will open it up for any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Lisa. We do have a few questions for you. You talked a lot about making sure to do one-on-one touch points or outreach with people, and you gave some examples already. In parish life, it can often be hard or overwhelming, especially in different ministries that we're involved in, to remember to, touch base with all of these different families or adults that we're working with. Have you and your team strategized or made, an intentional plan to outreach? So it's not something that, a few weeks in you're like, oh, I meant to text so-and-so, or I meant to send an email to this family. Have you guys figured out how to make sure that those one-on-one outreaches are actually happening?
Mm-hmm. I think something that we've found helpful is, and this sounds super mundane, but actually just scheduling it, like taking the very practical step. This is something I need to do or else I'll forget. Schedule, and it doesn't even have to have somebody's name, but just like I have 10 minutes a week set aside where I just have a little note in my calendar to text one of the girls in the small group that I run. And throughout the semester, I'll be able to get to each of them. So I think it has to be broken down, hopefully with your team, but also we're not talking about that every week you're contacting every person personally. Like, that's too much for you. And frankly, it's probably too much for them too. So yeah, that's what I would say. Break it up with the team and kind of find a time that works for you with a reminder that can go on your calendar, and just be okay with, yeah, 1 week at a time, one contact or one touch at a time, like that's an okay pace.
Awesome. We also had a few questions about people who have ministry kind of small groups that have been going on maybe for a semester, and that group is kind of formed and they have new people joining a small group, whether it's a couple people. Can you talk a little bit about how do you make sure that the dynamics work, that people who might be coming into an existing small group really feel welcomed?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to steal from Chris a little bit here and say the first thing is really working with the leaders so that they're equipped to like create that hospitable environment, and maybe they're even reaching out to that core group that already existed and saying, hey guys, we're going to have some new people joining, like let's really remember the first time we met, put ourselves like back in those shoes and really make an effort to welcome these new participants, and just like show through our actions and through like what we're sharing and even through our body language that we're happy they're there. We're not like, darn, our group is, like our BFF group is over. Because it's not, yeah, it's about the everyone. And that can be hard because we do form like deep relationships in our small groups. But going back to casting that vision that this is not just for us, it's for everyone. And so having that hospitality and really having that leader like ready to lead the charge.
Awesome. We kind of have we have a question about thinking in the future a little bit. This question is coming from someone. She started a small group for Hispanic women via Zoom. Some of the members live on the West Coast, Mexico. Some are from her parish in this area. Do you think she wants to know a little bit of? Do you think it'll be possible for us to continue to grow as a group once we come back in person to our parishes? And at that point, how do we adapt?
I think that some of these Zoom groups are with us for the long haul. So I think there's no reason to think that when things get back to normal, that small group necessarily needs to end. I would encourage the group to be like open to discerning where God is calling each of them, because it may unfold kind of like in people's individual hearts, like, oh, now that I can go back to my parish, I'm feeling this call to go back there. But yeah, I would be open to prayer and discerning it. And I would say if it'll probably become clear, like if the group keeps going, then it's probably filling a need and meant to keep going. And if it doesn't, to not be discouraged, but part of ending that group and being the leader of that group, I think, is helping everyone make that next step or that next connection point more locally.
Great. We have another question that's a really important one and a great one about boundaries. So what about boundaries between leaders and participants? How do you build in healthy boundaries from the beginning? Do you have to be friends with all of the people that you have in your small groups? How do you navigate that?
Yes, such a great question. So there's a book by Doctors Cloud and Townsend called Boundaries that everyone should read. It's on my top 10. Everyone should read this book. That helped me a lot. But I think it's up to the leader. Like maybe you're not going to give your cell phone out to everybody and you decide like my outreach is going to mainly be through email. And if you do give your cell phone out, like I do give my cell phone out, but I will kind of share with students like, hey, you can always text me, but just so you know, like I might not respond till I'm, but you know, back at work the next day, or if it's over the weekend, like I'll send a note to myself and be sure to get back to you, you know, on Monday, if it's not like an emergency crisis type situation. So laying out a little bit of boundaries depending on what you share can be helpful. I also think you can, if a situation, someone's coming to you, like I've been in this situation where they're asking for more than I can give, or they're treating me as a quasi counselor. And I usually don't lay out those kind of boundaries ahead of time, but just in the moment to recognize, okay, we need to have a discussion about this. I maybe need to make a referral for this person, and we need to talk about what is and isn't appropriate. So I don't know if that helps at all, but those are my tips.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of wanted to ask you a similar question to what I asked with Chris, because I know Chris talked about a couple of these small groups that he had with men. Do you have any experiences either in your college campus ministry or in your own life of creative ideas of different small groups that you've been a part of or that you've seen happen that are maybe out of what we're used to, out of the norm?
I don't think that I've been a part of any that are super creative. The ones I've been a part of have mainly been women's groups that kind of maybe follow a standard program, and that's kind of worked out for me. But I have seen people do small groups about almost anything and everything, and kind of like around affinity groups. So not me personally, but at Maryland, like a group based around like Greek life or like running club or whatever. So like finding hobbies that people have in common, creating a faith-based small group around that maybe like incorporates the thing that people are passionate about, whether it's cooking or running or whatever, fishing. And I think that's awesome. Like, I don't think we should be limiting ourselves to like, this has to be only we open a book and stick like only in that lane. And I also think it's helpful for small groups to kind of break up content if you are working through a series with, again, what's COVID appropriate, but like with a we're going bowling or like with a, you know, we're having a barbecue kind of thing, just to like build in that deeper community building and like relationship time that like when you're going through content gets a little chopped up in the course of a small group meeting.
Awesome. And I know you referenced that we do have kind of like a sample outline of a structured time within a small group meeting. Can you give an example of what that actually looks like for people?
Sure, definitely. So I think, zeroing in on your time, so maybe it's an hour to an hour and a half, and planning out some kind of flow like this. A time for gathering, whether that's people popping onto Zoom and kind of casual conversation or actually coming, to someone's house or to the parish. Some kind of welcome and opening prayer. And that can be of the leaders choosing. Maybe it's a prayer that they write, maybe it's reading the gospel of the day, maybe it's a prayer that they find from the USCCB. Maybe it's just a spontaneous prayer. Then moving into a time of just like check-in, kind of like a thing we talk a lot about with our students is like a high and low for the week, or something good that happened, or just how is everyone doing? And then moving from that kind of check-in into the content for the night, and that'll probably be the bulk of the small group meeting. So whether you're working your way through a Bible study or it's some kind of video that you're watching and then discussing, whatever that looks like. And then something I like to do is kind of ask people if they want to share prayer intentions. You don't have to do that, but I find that it is kind of like a nice ending, and then ending in a prayer, and then leaving time for some hospitality at the end. You can be doing that throughout if you have food or whatever. But yeah, some kind of flow with those pieces, move them around as you want.
Awesome. And then one last question for you is about kind of casting wide the net in our invitation to people. So I know Chris talked about it and you talked about making that personal invitation, and that can be hard sometimes, even if we're doing it for people that we know in our own life. But how, if we really are going to be a church, as Pope Francis describes, in the streets with people, how do we cast our net wide to the invitations that we're making to people in our parishes, especially now that we're in this virtual environment? We're not necessarily in parishes. So can you talk a little bit about what are some ways that we can do that even in this time of social distancing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a huge part of that is really advertising. And so something that we just did at the Catholic Center was started to do advertisements on Facebook and Instagram. And I think especially during COVID, like a lot of people, we're online more, we're with our phones, we don't have like the normal things that kind of put us on the road commuting and stuff like that. So that's one place where I would recommend. You may not get a ton of people who actually join the small group, but you can't unsee what you've seen. That's one thing we always say at the CSC. And so just putting it out there, like hanging the sign outside the parish. Our Lady of Mercy does this great. They're on a corner and they just make new signs for every small group program that they're doing. And so it just makes it visible. Again, it breaks down that like there are no secret small groups thing. Like that small groups are just there's an aspect of the promotion and advertising that's very, very public and beyond the people that you and I know, alongside that that intentional invitation piece as well. So I think you absolutely need to do both.
That's wonderful. And we're about to pass it back to Jonathan. I was just going to offer one of a creative suggestion that a couple of people had mentioned to me was trying to engage, in terms of our population with our young adults. We have a lot of young adults who are going to be home for the next few months. They might not be going back to their college campuses. And something that a friend of mine mentioned was reaching out to maybe the DRE or someone involved in religious ed at your parish and asking them, who were the students that you had 4 or 5 years ago? Can you reach out to them? They're now 18, 19, 20 years old, in need of community in a small group. you know, is there a way to reach out to those families and really try to make that invitation that they still have, you know, their parish home and that wants to connect with them and really walk with them during this uncertain time. So I want to end with that. Lisa, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all of your great work at the University of Maryland and all of your. And if you have more questions for Lisa or things that might come up, her email is down here at the bottom. And at this point, I'm going to pass it back to Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you, Molly. Lisa, I really loved a lot of what you were talking about, especially that parable of the lost sheep, to have that sort of generosity of spirit, to not have those private small groups, and to really make a plan for how we're going to reach out to build those relationships. Because I know in my experience in life, even as an extrovert, as Catholics, I think we default to programs or to ministry groups, as opposed to taking maybe some more personal responsibility to say, I'm going to go introduce myself to that one person, or I'm going to follow up from the person who came to our group meeting for the first time and have a cup of coffee with them. And I think that ministry of accompaniment is just woven so beautifully to how you described the importance of making a plan for small group ministry. So thank you.